Okay, we will go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is John. I'm an account executive here at Knapsack. And today we're going to talk about how teams are changing their digital production by using the Knapsack platform. Now, before we jump directly into the product, which I promise we'll get to in just a moment, I want to set some context for what we're looking at today. We're going to spend about 5 minutes or so on what teams are facing right now with digital production and how Knapsack can help. So here's the problem that we're solving here at Knapsack. Enterprise teams should be able to ship at the pace of their ideas, right? The industry has been trying to solve this for years. While design systems have helped with creating, context or guidelines, the implementation of those design systems often leaves a lot left to be desired. In our opinion, incremental change just isn't enough anymore, in our opinion and the industry's opinion, right? Digging deeper into why we can't ship at the pace of our ideas right now, we discover a web of disconnected tools, siloed roles, manual workflows. Designers, developers, and product teams are all still so isolated that it creates frustrating misalignments, really. Everyone is working hard, yet progress still feels slow and cumbersome. And the complexity doesn't ease over time, it multiplies. As companies expand, they introduce new products, they absorb new brands, maybe they're adopting additional frameworks. The challenge of coordination, it grows exponentially. Eventually, the complexity we see, it reaches a breaking point, right? The systems that we've built to manage the chaos begin to falter, and they're unable to withstand the rising demands that we put on them. What we see is that teams get frustrated. They often revert to old patterns. They sacrifice the efficiency and the alignment that they so desperately sought in the first place. This is why we created Knapsack. It doesn't disrupt your existing workflows or force changes on your team. We know that designers will still use Figma, developers will still rely on their coding environments. Instead, Knapsack leverages these familiar tools, creating a unified collaborative space. Think of it as a single source of truth where everyone can become involved, right? And with Knapsack bridging those silos, teams can finally leverage their existing assets in powerful new ways. What we see is they dramatically accelerate the speed and the effectiveness of their digital production. And the real transformation occurs when teams don't just reference their assets, they actively use them. Knapsack will help transform static guidelines and isolated components into dynamic, reusable resources, empowering teams to rapidly craft and refine exceptional digital experiences. And because Knapsack is specifically designed for enterprise teams, we've embedded crucial features such as single sign-on, real granular user permissions, a robust SOC 2 compliance. These aren't just merely added conveniences, they're foundational elements assuring secure, scalable enterprise operations, right? And because we're committed to ongoing innovation, this month, Knapsack, we are introducing an MCP server that integrates with all of the different AI technologies out there, right? Teams they'll soon be able to interact directly with their design system through AI tools such as ChatGPT or Gemini, and encoding platforms like Cursor and others, really pushing the boundaries of creativity and efficiency even further, but most importantly, rooted within the design decisions that you all have made. So now that we've painted the clear picture of the challenges that we see in the market and how Knapsack provides relief, let's dive into the platform itself and see firsthand how these concepts come to life. Before we actually look through this workspace, if you'd like to set up a one-on-one conversation with me or Mr. Bloom, you see waving his hand down there, who is our sales engineer, feel free to reach out to us at sales@knapsack.cloud. That is knapsack.cloud, not knapsack.com. So let's get to it. 7 minutes in, we finally get to talk about the workspace. Everybody, this is why you've come, right? What you're looking at is a workspace within Knapsack. As you can see, I've navigated to a URL. This is a cloud. This is a product that is accessible through the cloud. It is also accessible locally on your machine. Unfortunately, we won't get into a lot of details about that today, but if we have any developers on the call, just know that you can interact with Knapsack locally through your IDE as well. So with that being said, what Knapsack is, it's a place where everybody can come collaborate in the same space around your design, your code, and how to implement those into product, right? What are we talking about? Let's go look at some components, right? The thing you'll notice right off the bat is we're providing teams with the ability to wrap their arms around what it is they have available, or perhaps when it might become available, right? A lot of teams have this spread out in a bunch of shared spreadsheets or Jira tickets, right? Getting an understanding of what we have and if it's ready for use is so valuable, just that and alone, itself alone. But if we go in to click to any of these, individual components, right, these patterns, what we'll see is the stuff you would expect to see around like documenting that component, right? An overview, when to use, when not to, those sorts of things, right? This is all a WYSIWYG editor. Actually, it is. If I go into edit mode, let me do that real quick. What I'm actually doing is I'm opening up a new branch within Knapsack. It's actually underneath the hood, opening up a new branch in your Git repository, but that's a conversation for another time. Just know that everything that you can use here through the elements in the UI, you don't have to be a technical person to do so. So with that being said, this is a WYSIWYG editor, so I can create the kind of content I want right here within this web editing experience. Knapsack is built on a block system, so we can drag and drop and move these around and change the shapes and sizes. There are a ton of different blocks that we support, anything from your very basic blocks like tables or texts, all the way to the more interesting, like your design your design blocks and your actual coded component blocks, which we'll talk about here in a second. As we scroll down, we get to different ways to document our components, the things that we've created. And you'll notice here that I've got my 3 button sizes here, documented here visually and in copy as well. But what we're looking at here is not an image, a static image of our buttons. These aren't screen grabs. These aren't even design comps. What these are the actual rendered uses of our button. So we've got Knapsack connected to our repo. We tell Knapsack where to find this button template, this package, right? And then once we do that, we get to loop over the different size variations or the different type variations or the different mode variations, right? We can change the sizes of these demos here within our documentation. What this is doing is it's ensuring that the thing that we can actually use in product is what is being shown directly in our documentation, right? So for instance, if I've got my t-shirt sizes of small, medium, and large for my button, and for some reason we decide that we want a size extra large button, right? And we iterate on this component and we create a new version. Knapsack's continuously reading this package just like any product would be out in the real world. So the documentation is going to update itself with that size extra large. This is ensuring that we stay in sync, right? And there's no frustration between what our expected documentation says and what we can actually use within product, right? There's a lot more to talk about that in a moment, but let's switch over from the design side, because Knapsack can help you create design documentation as well, right? When we're adding a tab here and I choose my design source, I can very easily see which Figma files I have connected to my design system, right? I can add new files if I need to. I can preview any of these components that it's finding over in Figma, in this case, my header. But in this case, we're building out our button documentation. So I'm going to select that, right? And then what Knapsack's doing is it's pulling all the information that it's finding from Figma around my button component, right? And it's displaying it here, creating a whole page of documentation in just a couple seconds, right? It's not just showing us visually what it's bringing from Figma, but also the spec that's associated with it as well, right? And we can, explore this further, and we can figure out what it is that what the intent of this button actually was, right? But I can take this one step further, because for the first time, we can compare the design intent right next to, on the same page, the coded implementation of our button. Now, in a perfect world, these would be identical, right? That's always our goal. In reality, that's not always the case, right? Maybe it's a 1 or 2 or 10 or 30 iterations before we get this exactly the same, right? But the goal is to identify any differences much earlier in the process, rather than say, at the 11th hour, before we're about to ship a new experience, right, out to the market, right? We want no delays. So if we can compare what the design intent and user reality actually looks like, and by the way, the props or the specs that are associated with each much earlier in the process, how much time can we save in our digital production? In fact, Knapsack users save about 30% of the time they were spending in QA alone. And this is one of the reasons why, right? Because we can fully document, we can fully understand, we can run the accessibility and keep it all here in our documentation under one source. We're not going to Figma, we're not going to Storybook, we're not going to whatever tool, Confluence or Notion or whatever you might use, right, for documentation. It's all here, right? And then because we're actually using the coded component to power our documentation, right? Then we get to, as a non-technical person, and Bloom loves this too because it saves him a lot of time as our engineer, right? He doesn't have to go through and build out all the different variations in Storybook of our buttons, right? It allows a non-technical user to be able to do this. So we can create a primary button or a secondary button. We can even design or prototype for a new experience. For, say, I want to put a button in my side nav. Like, what would that look like? Let me see what I have as far as my asset sets that already exist within my design system, but let me interact with them so I can see what this looks like if I add additional text. Does that text wrap? Does the button expand? What does it look like in a different mode? What are my sizes, right? We can do all this without having to start in Figma every single time and go through that waterfall type of workflow, right? We can start here with the existing code and see what's available for us, right? Saves teams a ton of time in the digital production process. Now, buttons are simple. Maybe not, maybe that's a little bit of a misnomer, but they seem simple, right? Let's go to something more complex, right? Let's go see a different component. Let's look at our chart, right? Because I've got a chart here that, while I have a bunch of data points and a bunch of other properties or other things that I can change in here and manipulate, I've also got a hover state, right? I've also got, let me see here, let me show it. I've also got, in my motion, I've got some animation here with my chart as well. Now, in Knapsack, we can very quickly switch through different themes or modes. So if this is my Arcadia brand chart, what does Arcadia Dark look like, right? We can see that right away. Or what does my Knapsack brand mode look like? Or maybe I want to keep my Knapsack brand, but I want a slower animation timing, right? We can do all this in just as simple as switching it out, the themes and modes right here within the UI. That allows teams or organizations that have, say, dozens or even hundreds sometimes of brands, right, to be able to use the same componentry but styled different ways and switch through those very quickly and easily, right? And that's all configurable here in our design section, right? We can look at we can look at these different themes, how these are built out. These are mapped, they can be mapped one-to-one with your Figma variables, right? You can import those really easily into Knapsack. And then we've got base design tokens as well, which again, we can import, but we can also manipulate here within the UI as well. But let me go back to my modes here, and let me say, okay, for my Knapsack mode, maybe for this theme here, maybe we, let's see here, maybe we want to change our brand color to, say, this interesting yellow, right? We're going crazy today, Bloom. And we're gonna make all of the knapsack stuff that used to be that nice pinkish coral-ish color into, oops, wrong button, into this nice mustard yellow. So let's go back and see what that looks like now in the Knapsack brand. Great.
Oh
We
yeah, that's
can,
the good stuff.
yeah, we can. Now, if you have the proper permissions, right? I'm logged in as an admin, so I can make some manipulations here. Your consumers wouldn't be able to do this, right? It's locked down to whatever permission set you give. But as a contributor, as an admin, I could very easily go and change my brand color, and then I could publish this live, right? And package all this up, and then I could tap Bloom on the shoulder and say, hey, go bump your packages. We just updated our brand, right? Our brand color. All that is possible because it's a fully connected design to code to CI/CD to product pipeline, right? And that's what makes Knapsack different than other tools that are out there in the marketplace, is it's directly connected to how you ship these ideas, right? Now, of course, the enterprise red tape gets in the way a lot, but that's not because of us. That's because of your all's enterprise and the size and the restrictions that you have, right? Which are good, don't get me wrong. We need those checks and balances. So let's look at a couple more places here, and then we'll go ahead and we'll answer some questions as well. Because all of this, everything that we're talking about, all the documentation, all the design concepts, the design tokens, the code concepts, right? They all bubble up into our prototyping area. And prototyping was born out of the fact that we talk to a lot of folks in the industry every day. And, we consistently get heard, we get asked, when we hear, hey, John, this is great. How can you help us with adoption, right? We want to make sure, we're all just justifying our existence. We know that we're providing value to product teams, but can you help us show the adoption levels? And the answer to that is yes, we can show that adoption and help you with our analytics behind the scenes for the workspace. But what's even more powerful is not just showing that teams are using it, it's enabling product teams to use this in the most easiest way. We have a saying here at Knapsack, let's make the right thing the easy thing, because the easy thing is what teams are going to do. So what we're looking at here is basically a bigger version of what we saw before. I've got a list of components and I've assembled them in a specific order. Of course, I can drag and drop these, but this is, think of this as a prototype of a landing page, right? Where we've got a couple base components in here. Now, we're not just limited to this. I am, because this is all I have is a data set in here, these 10 components or so. But we're not just limited to what you see, right? We can actually come in here and actually manipulate each of these component sets, right? So for instance, I've got a template grid here, and I've got, which is made up of 3 basic cards. Say I want to add a button into my first card here, and I want to add a primary button. Say I want to add a secondary button, I can do that too. Now we can see everything re-render live on screen as I do that, right? And we can see that my primary button and my secondary button, they're actually different sizes. So let me go back in here, and I'm going to change my secondary button, and I want to show a large button so that at least they're matched together, right? But as you can see, I still have some user experience issues going on here. I've got no padding, no gap in between here. So I'm going to come back to the card, and I'm going to say, I want to use one of my design tokens here, and I want to implement a spacing token. And I'm going to do, let's do a 16. There we go. My medium spacing token. That looks a little wide. Let's go down to 8. No, let's go down here. Let's grab the right one. Let's go down to 8 pixels. There we go. That looks a little better, right? Or maybe you're saying, yeah, this is great, but actually I want them stacked on top of each other, right? Okay, so we go and we change the layout to vertical. We can do all of this, right, without leaving the prototype. We don't have to go into each individual component on their own page, right? It's all compiled one place here for us to use, right? And if we wanted to change the imagery on these on these cards, we can change the images, we can change the descriptions and the titles. We can get really close to that prototype of what we're trying to launch, right? The goal here is, and stop me if you've heard this one before, it's like we spent all of this time creating all these assets, and then in product they go and break it all, right? Or they are in Figma, it's an infinite canvas, and they detach their componentry, and they change the styling, and they change the, all the brand guidelines that we've baked in here. And that's why we want to enable teams to use the coded component with the constraints that you all have already set, right? Because you get to choose which components are able to be docked inside of my button or inside of my card. Could you put a header in here in Figma? Sure, you could, but why would you, right? Because your team is the one who actually gets to choose those restrictions, right? So what we're doing is we're allowing teams to start to rapidly prototype with assets that are already built versus starting from scratch every single time, right? We're seeing teams cut 3, 4, 5, 6 months out of their process of launching new products by first using the assets that are already created, and then decide like, oh, maybe I need a date picker that for my checkout flow, because we're going to determine when this should be delivered, right? I'm using an example here, but we don't have a date picker. Okay, great. We've identified something that we should actually go build, right? That's the difference versus starting from scratch and designing every time. Now, we can do the same thing, right? We can say, okay, this is great, but let me see this, what it would look like in our Knapsack brand instead of our Arcadia brand, which is definitely not accessibility compliant with that yellow and white for sure. So we need to work on that. Anyway, we can do that. We can switch themes. We can support multiple brands. In addition, we can actually show what we're looking at here and how this has been assembled in code as well, right? So now you can shoot this over to your friendly neighborhood dev and say, here's what I'm thinking, here's what I'm trying to do. Or maybe perhaps you're wanting to share this via URL, right? And we can open this up in its own URL endpoint. We can put this through link-based regression testing, through accessibility testing. We can check for, responsiveness when it comes to what we're trying to build. So many different things that we can do here. But again, we can only do it if we have design and code and documentation all in the same place. We can't have it scattered out all over the place. So lots of value to the team who's contributing and maintaining the design system, even more value for the product team who actually is consuming and using the design system. And we talked about at the beginning, launching our MCP. Listen, I know one thing, documentation is really great to have. I know one thing that's even better is not having to read that documentation. We're already seeing use cases where you can query against your design system so to allow product teams to very quickly understand. Or maybe you want to compose entire new experiences like you see in this prototyping section using generative AI, but with the constraints of your design system behind it. Thank you so much for listening for the last 25 minutes. I appreciate your time. I'm going to look to see what kind of questions we have in the chat. Christopher Bloom, is there anything that I forgot to talk about?
Nope, covered it. That was perfect, especially with the talk about the integration to MCP and what we are enabling for AI integration to your guys' workflows. So yeah, super important, and stay tuned for that.
Yeah, I think the most interesting thing about in the world of AI that we live in today is that while it's extremely interesting and exciting, right? Very little of it that's out there is built for enterprise with the enterprise constraints in mind, right? So that's how we're building our Knapsack AI. Right now, it's just the MCP server that can connect to other AI tools. In about 3 to 4 months, it'll be that composition that you looked at, that prototyping here within the UI as well, in plain language prompts saying something like, hey, Knapsack, create me a checkout experience using all of my design system assets with my primary and secondary colors, and have at it. Give me a first pass, right? That's the goal, using your design system as both the food and the leash, the constraint for that virtual pet, your AI assistant. That's all we've got today. There was one question, great question on the Q&A here. The question is, so I'll read it for everybody, is the implementation of a component targeted to web, giving the example of like React or Angular, or can I also use Knapsack for mobile, especially Kotlin and Jetpack Compose for Android? The answer to that question is a little bit of both. What we're looking at being rendered here live on the screen is web only, because Well, quite honestly, we're rendering web type components in the web. We don't have an application for mobile yet. Now, with that being said, we do have a ton of customers that are using all the other aspects, the design tokens, the documentation, the status sets, code snippets, all of that for mobile as well, right? The piece that's missing and that we're working on is specifically for rendering those mobile components, which at this point in time usually still are static images. But great question. My recommendation would be to utilize Knapsack for web and mobile for right now. And then once we get those renderers in Knapsack at a future date, we're already set up with all of your context and all of your documentation ready to go. That is it for us today. Thank you so much for coming. Again, sales@knapsack.cloud. If you have any other questions or you want to talk, more one-on-one with your specific use cases, we're happy to do that. Thanks, everyone.